Okay, so covering today memories, particularly techniques to enhance your memory, as well as theories of why we forget information. So first, looking at the specific parts of the brain that are involved in the formation of memories. So we have the frontal lobes, which are involved in short-term memory. So remember, that is that memory of very limited capacity, holds information for about 30 seconds, and is responsible for passing sensory information onto long-term memory, and also for working with, so remember that working memory, working with the information that we've taken from long-term memory that we are actively using right now. Long-term declarative memories associated with functioning in the hippocampus. So remember, declarative memories are knowing some kind of information. Your prefrontal cortex, so that's the PFC, is involved in encoding pictures and words. Procedural memory associated with functioning in the cerebellum. So remember, procedures are your procedural memory, or your memory for how to do something, so knowing how. And remember, the cerebellum is also involved in things like movement and balance, and oftentimes procedural memories involve some kind of action, right? They involve doing something. So it makes sense then that the cerebellum would be involved in these particular kinds of memories. And then long-term memories we have with the cerebral cortex involved as well. So in looking at how memories are formed, there is a process called consolidation, and this oftentimes happens as a result of synaptic functioning, so synapses forming and connecting to one another, and also happens as we sleep. So it's really important then to make sure that you are getting an adequate amount of sleep so that this process of consolidation can occur. Consolidation basically means that a long-term memory becomes durable and stable. So that means that it truly does become a long-term memory. Okay, so let's talk about some theories of why we forget. So first we have what's called the serial position effect. Okay, so let's break this down. So serial, this means something that is in a series, okay? So you're looking at a series, an ordered ranking. And then the position, so looking at the position of something that is in a series. And so the serial position effect then states that we are most likely to recall items that come first in a list and items that come last in a list. And we then tend to forget the items that are in the middle. So when we recall the items that are first in a list, this is called the primacy effect. When we recall the items that are last in the list, this is called the recency effect. Okay, so let's say that you have, a list of 8 numbers. You would be most likely to recall the first couple of numbers. They explain the primacy effect by stating that you can recall the first couple of numbers pretty easily because there's no interference. There's nothing else, in your memory at that point that is interfering or might be preventing you from actually remembering the first couple. As we keep going on in the list, though, now you have 6 or 7 pieces of information that are competing, and so you kind of lose the ones along the way. And then the last ones, you recall the numbers that are last in the list with the recency effect, because these are the items in the list that you've been the most recently exposed to. So they're kind of the freshest in your mind. Okay, so another reason that we might not be overly great at remembering things all the time has to do with this process of encoding. And sometimes we do not encode effectively. So encoding is basically taking in the salient features of something. So looking at these pennies here, I want you to determine if you can pick out the one that is the correct image of the US penny. Let's see how good you guys are at encoding this information. So pause it, choose the correct image of the US penny. The correct one is in the bottom left corner, the bottom left corner. So if you got that right, great job. You probably have really good encoding skills. If you didn't get it right, it could be indicative that, we see this all of the time, but we might not be that great at picking out the particular features that are going to aid us in being able to remember this later on down the line, and that's the process of encoding. Other ways that we can remember information, so this process of rehearsal, where we're basically reviewing or practicing the material. So with maintenance rehearsal, this is rote repetition of material. So rote repetition means that you are basically repeating word for word, verbatim, exactly what you were told, okay? So you're basically memorizing the information. With elaborative rehearsal, you are associating the information that you're trying to learn with stuff that you already know. So you're trying to connect new information to stuff that you already know. So one of the problems then with maintenance rehearsal, with this rote repetition, is that you could easily regurgitate or completely, recite back a passage. Let's say you're, preparing for a play that you'll be doing in one of your English classes. You could easily recite back a passage of William Shakespeare's plays. But does that mean that you understand it? Not necessarily, right? So maintenance rehearsal, although you can reproduce the information, it doesn't necessarily mean that you actually get it. With elaborative rehearsal, though, because you're associating this new information with things that you've already know, that you've already stored, you're creating these deeper connections. And that is going to allow you to be able to remember this information better because you're processing the information at a deeper level. So that takes us down to this concept of deep processing. With deep processing, you're looking at the meaning instead of looking at more superficial or surface features. So maintenance rehearsal is very much a surface processing, right? You're just repeating information, you've memorized it, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get it. With elaborative rehearsal, though, you are processing this information to figure out what it actually means. So other examples here, with deep processing, you might try to analyze the semantic features of different words. So psychology has a lot of vocabulary that is associated with it. And if you try to break these words down to actually understand the meaning, these terms will probably make a lot more sense to you. So for example, psychodynamic, if we break that down into two smaller words, psycho comes to us from psyche, the Greek for the mind, right? So the mind, and then dynamic. If something is dynamic, it has it's multifaceted. It has many different parts. So the many different parts of the mind, psychodynamic. Sensory motor, we'll talk about this when we get into development. Sensory motor, looking at the senses and motor movement. And Jean Piaget, a developmental psychologist, proposed that this is how very, very young infants actually learn about the world around them. Okay, so other ways that we can try to remember information by using what are called mnemonic devices. And so mnemonic devices then are these strategies or tricks, and they often use some kind of a verse or a formula. So maybe you've heard of "Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally" to help you remember order of operations for math. Roy-G-Biv, this is for the colors of the rainbow spectrum, and then 30 days hath September, April, June, and November to help you to be able to remember how many days are in each month. Okay, so let's talk about why we forget. So forgetting is adaptive, right? We have already established that you are bombarded every day with so much information. There's no way that you could ever possibly process all of it. So we need to be able to forget some things if we want to remember other things efficiently, effectively. So theories of forgetting, we can talk first about something called decay theory. Decay theory basically states if you don't use it, you lose it. Okay, so this theory that information is in your memory eventually disappears if you don't access it. And decay theory applies more to short-term memory than it does to long-term memory, particularly because with long-term memory, we might have people who have not accessed, information about something that happened to them 30 years ago for a very, very long time, but given the proper cues, they can access that information very, very quickly. So it seems to apply then more to the short-term memory than it does to long-term memory. Interference. So similar information interferes with one another. So there are two kinds of information. So we have retroactive interference and proactive interference. So with retroactive interference, you forget when the information that you learned second interferes with the information that you learned first. Okay, so let's say that you go to a party and you meet someone named Julie. Okay, so you meet Julie first, and then later on in the evening, you meet someone named Judy. Julie and Judy, those are similar pieces of information, right? So then the next time that you see Julie, if you have retroactive interference going on, you call Julie Judy. So the information that you learned second is interfering with the information that you learned first. With proactive interference, it's just the opposite. So with proactive interference, you forget when the information that you learned first interferes with the information that you learned second. So same thing going on. You meet Julie first, then you meet Judy later on, and then you bump into Judy later on and you call her Julie. So the information that you learned first interferes with the information that you learned second with proactive interference. There's also something called cue-dependent forgetting. So cues are basically what kind of triggers us to be able to recall information. So your state can be a cue that triggers you to be able to recall information, particularly with this concept of state-dependent memory. And with state-dependent memory, you remember something when you're in the same physical or mental state as you were when you originally learned the information or when you were originally exposed to this information. So there are numerous studies that have looked at trying to teach rats how to go through a maze, and they will have the rats on some kind of drug, some kind of substance, and have the rats learn the maze. And then later on, they put the rat back in the same maze, but the rat is not under the influence of any substances. And guess what? The rat cannot get through the maze quickly. But as soon as they put the rat back on that same drug, put the rat in the maze, that is a cue, right? The rat's physical state of being under the influence of that drug then is a cue, and that allows the rat to be able to remember how to get through the maze quickly. Mood-congruent memory. Mood can be another cue to help us remember. So with mood-congruent memory, then, we have a tendency to remember experiences that are consistent, that line up with your mood, and we overlook experiences that are not consistent with your mood. So, for example, we can look at individuals who suffer from depression, and when their mood is depressed, they have a tendency to remember only things that match that mood. So they will focus on being depressed and all of these awful, terrible things that have happened to them, and there's no hope for the future and nothing will ever change, and they overlook any kind of positive things that are going on for them currently. Replacement, another theory of forgetting. Replacement basically states that when you learn new information, so when new information enters your memory, it wipes out old information. So we saw this earlier with the serial position effect. And we said that the recency effect, you are likely to remember the information that comes at the end of the list. So that's the newest information that you've learned, and that might wipe out the stuff in the middle. So there are a number of different techniques that you can use to potentially enhance your memory, and these are all outlined for you in your book, and I'll encourage you to also watch several of the videos to learn about different techniques that you can use and actually apply to your life as a student to enhance your memory.